we need to have a better sense of self and a better sense of where we're going when we decide that we're going to take off that uniform.
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes of veteran mental health. I'm your host, Dwayne France. Let's get ready to make sure that your headspace and timing set correctly. Hey everybody, welcome to Headspace and Timing. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for checking us out. As many of you who serve know, the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal, is one of the greatest weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing isn't set right, however, it's just a huge chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my mission here, to raise awareness about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week we'll talk about different aspects of veteran mental health and interview mental health professionals that are working with veterans, service members, and their families around the country. Hey folks, thanks for checking out the Headspace and Timing podcast again. We're trying to change the way that you think about veteran mental health. As you might have heard, this month, November, we're trying to make it the month of the military podcaster. And when our primary hosts, Eddie and Bennett, kind of brought this up, a couple names popped into my head, and my guest today was one of the first that popped into my head. So I'm pleased to bring him on. I'd like to introduce someone that's probably fairly well known to many of the podcast listeners anyway, the host of Veteranology, Mr. Jay Knight. Jay, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dwayne. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagining that there are a few listeners who may not know or may not have listened to Veteranology, how about you tell them a little bit about yourself and your show and things like that?
Right. Just a real quick spiel. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, served in the infantry with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines during my 4 years from 04 to 08. Got out of the service, went to college, graduated with an econ degree, biked across the country in honor of a buddy of mine, raised money for a children's charity, got laid off a few times after that, ended up in Colorado, and after a few incidents that revolved around suicide in my military unit, 2-7, I decided to start a podcast to start talking about the stories of successful individuals who have left the service and found their next calling. So the whole idea is, when you go in, you hear all these stories of Medal of Honor winners and people that, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, I've taken it upon myself to find the giants that have left the service and whom we can follow and lead from.
Yeah, and that's and you've done a good job. I mean, I think that when I first started listening to podcasts, I know you and I have maybe almost a year or so, we've been talking back and forth, but I always appreciated how your podcast was very real. I mean, it was, I think in one of the episodes we're going to talk about here, I talk about how it's the closest thing that anybody who's not been in the military would get to listening to two infantry squad leaders talking to each other, right? I mean, it's almost like, a peek into the squad bay or something like that.
Right. And there's a lot of work that goes into making that happen, making that conversation happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and of course you have your own story too, and listeners can go back and look in your show and talk about just the whole bike ride across the country and the idea of guys walking off the war or riding off the war and stuff like that. And you have a couple episodes where you've talked about that. Was that for you? Was that important to sort of transition away from combat or away from the military into the civilian world?
I refer to the bike ride as the biggest Band-Aid I needed. I'm never going to turn off some of these things that have happened in my head. Recently, I shared some of my combat stories with a very close friend that I've made, and he asked me, he's like, you're like kind of there right now, aren't you? I was like, yeah, I am. Like, as I was telling that story, I mean, I'm reliving it. But at the same time, it felt good to tell the story. And so for me, the bike ride was just a kind of a wound I had a very hard time healing after I got out, because there was, survivor's guilt and losing somebody that I was very close with. And I kind of was able to close a chapter when I finally got done with the bike ride and move on.
And it's interesting you talk about, of course, I see it in the veterans that I work with all the time, that as we retell these events that we find ourselves back there, almost transported. I explain it as the difference between sitting in the audience of a play. If I tell my story and I'm distanced from it, I see it going on stage, versus actually being within the play, being live and in the environment. And figuring out the more often, in my experience, the more often that we share these stories, the easier it is for us to be in the audience rather than to be on the stage in the play.
Yeah, no, I think the more you talk about it, the more you distance yourself from being in it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, your podcast, as you said, is not specifically about veteran mental health, which is why I wanted you to bring on you and the other guests that I have in the next couple weeks to talk about what you've learned about veteran mental health while you've been going through the episodes. I think I saw on the website, and of course we'll link to the website and all of these shows that we're going to talk about. But you're up to about 30 shows. But before we get into that, I remember you and I, when you had me on as a guest of your show, and you had talked about something that happened during that bike ride that you really kind of differentiated as sort of two kind of people in the world. And my goal of trying to help veterans get their stories out, both as a mental health professional and then also on this podcast, is that idea of storytelling. So would you care to recount that story that you told me about the storytellers and the check riders? Right.
Just out of respect and the fact that I'm not someone who wants to throw anyone under the bus, but on one particular hospital visit that I had been planning, they hadn't given me any indication that they were going to allow me to come in. And then finally on one phone call, the woman who was with the particular group of people, she was part of the Child Life. And for those of you who don't know, Child Life are the people inside of the children's hospitals who are working alongside the nurses to make sure that the children stay educated, that they stay active, that they stay engaged with growing up. Play is the work of children. And so it's important that these kids, if they miss 2 weeks of school, that's an incredible hardship. If you and I miss 2 weeks of work, we'll catch up, Right. We're developed adults. So anyway, when I was telling them what I was doing, they're like, well, honestly, we feel that because you're doing this in honor of a fallen Marine, that story is too scary and we don't want you to come to our hospital. And it was the only hospital that said this to me. And at the time I was just I was so involved with trying to honor my friend, right? And so my jaw hits the floor, and I'm furious, and I'm sad, and there's tears in my eyes, and I don't know how to react to someone telling me that they're scared of me.
Right.
And eventually, through a nonprofit I was working with, it just so happened. So much happenstance happened on this bike ride. But this particular instance was I met with a congressman from that district, and he just happened to be going to the children's hospital the day that I had originally planned to go. I just kind of planned a route around the hospital because we weren't going to stop. But he's like, you know what? No. I'll call you in a couple hours. So he calls me in a couple hours. And he's like, hey, meet me at this entrance at such and such time. I'm like, okay, sure. So we got up really early, and we made the 40-mile bike ride that morning to the hospital. So we got up pretty early. And we pull up, and right as we pull up, he comes out of his car, and he's like, all right, boys, come on, follow me. So we walk in, and immediately these two security guards start moving towards me and Denny because, we're coming up with bicycles and our bikes have trailers and, we were very out of place. But the congressman's like, no, they're with me. And these guys don't know who this guy is. And then all of a sudden, the vice president of communications of this hospital system comes up and greets him and says, hey, you two grab these guys' bikes and put them somewhere safe. So we're escorted into the hospital and we're escorted into this conference room. And I'm sitting in the conference room and I'm sitting right next to the vice president of this, huge hospital. Not just hospital, but the entire network of hospitals throughout the state. And across from him is the congressman's chief of staff, the head of child life, and then the woman who said I was too dangerous to come to the hospital.
All the way at the other end.
And like the tension could be cut with a knife. And the VP led in and introduced himself and wanted to thank me for what I was doing. And the congressman and him had a conversation about what I was doing. And we never really brought up what the woman said. And I never wanted to, have this person skylined for what she did because she was protecting her kids.
Sure.
And what she understood as the military isn't what you and I understand as the military. But what happened was at the end of the conversation, the congressman kind of looks straight at her and kind of goes back and forth between the VP and this girl. And he said, I know you guys only care sometimes about the people who write checks. But there are two types of people in this world. People who write checks and people who tell stories. And people don't write checks without stories. And that really resonated with me for the rest of the trip. And, I had already been a very vocal person on the bike ride, like trying to tell my story as much as possible and why I was doing what I was doing. But that put a lot of fire behind me.
Yeah, and that's the telling the story piece and getting the message out there. As I mentioned, I often say, the guns don't go silent when we redeploy, and so veterans shouldn't go silent either. Of course, it doesn't mean that, telling our war stories down at the corner bar and things like that, but if we keep silent about our stories, people don't know, and that the greater distance is between those individuals who don't understand the military. But also, what we were talking about earlier, not getting it out can kind of perpetuate that feeling of being there. And so, you then, through several iterations, but you've become a storyteller, and helping others get their stories out there.
Mm-hmm. And it's difficult sometimes, not in the fact that I can't get someone to talk, but in figuring out the best way to approach someone. With that first episode that you wrote about with Russell Davies, Russell and I, we didn't know each other. He was in the infantry in the Army. I was Marines. We served at different times. He was in Afghanistan. I was in Iraq. But I told him what I was doing, and I knew what he was doing. And so, we initially have that bond, but for me, I want to make sure that people trust me because, I'm holding their voice in my hand. I can edit something and make them sound different. Like that's a power that, while it doesn't seem very intense, it's something I take very seriously because I do not want anyone to ever come on my show and feel like they weren't able to, or that they sounded stupid or like they didn't know what they were talking about or whatever it is. There's a lot of things that can happen once your voice is out there. So, I take the time. I took 30 minutes. I was walking through Target looking for soap. And I was having a conversation with Russell, like, hey, I'd really like to talk about this. Is this okay? Is that okay? What are you trying to do? And so in doing that, I make sure that I experience the person and what they're feeling so that by the time I get them in front of my microphone, they have already somewhat separated themselves from being in the situation that they're going to talk to me about. And, in saying that, I think when we engage our friends, our family members who may have gone through these kind of traumatic things, I don't think you should have a goal in mind for trying to help someone. Like, oh, he has PTSD, he lost a buddy. Don't have a goal in mind for that first conversation or that second or third. But as that person gets used to maybe talking about it, maybe, and you probably see this in therapy, is the second and third and fourth, you start to open up more and more, and you find these things that allow you to connect. And to you veterans out there, the same thing happens as you continue to talk. Like, maybe you only talk with your buddies. You don't want to talk with your civilian friends about stuff. Eventually, if you do open up your heart and tell your story, I feel like those walls will come crumbling down, and you feel more comfortable. You feel more engaged with the people around you because there's not that underlying idea of, oh, this person doesn't get me.
No, and that's really a great point. The idea of building trust, because I'm going to give you this story, or I'm going to give you this very real and important memory of mine, and it really is a gift. And whether or not it's going to be used against me in the future, building that trust is critical. And I could tell, and you referenced that episode number 5 with Russell Davies, that there was a level of trust. And that's the one, again, that I had mentioned, that it sounded like 2 infantry squad leaders talking to each other. Yeah, you were in the Marines, he was in, the Army, different occupational, as many differences as there could have been, that which united you was greater than that which divided you. And that was one of the first shows that I think came to my mind that I listened to, that said, you guys are talking about veteran mental health without specifically addressing veteran mental health. That Russell was talking, he freely talked about the incident that occurred, I think both, if I remember correctly, and then how he tried to recover from that. And I think those stories are critical for other veterans to be able to hear that modeled.
Yeah, and he's very active on Facebook, and you would never know by looking at him that he deals with pain. That he deals with mental health. He deals with helping other people with their mental health. One of the things that I like my show for is kind of demystifying being a veteran.
Right, and that's critical, is to say, hey, this is what, we're not, and I think you and I, and I talk about this often, we're not whatever the stereotype somebody sees us, that villain or that mythic hero, striding across the battlescape saving the world, or a victim, some broken-winged bird. We're human, and I definitely very much on the nose try that with mental health. But what I like for what you and some of the other hosts that we'll have on is that you talk about it without talking about it. It's just part of the conversation because it's part of who we were.
Right. But I am lucky enough that, I made my mission statement pretty broad, where I'm here to interview veterans who have found their next place. But tagged on to the end of that mission statement is to also interview people who are involved in the backdrop of veteran life. So doctors, lawyers, caseworkers, things like that, because they have just such a different perspective. And I think it's worth talking about. And I have yet to have a non-veteran actually on the show. But I did get to talk with Dr. Craig Bryan, who is the executive director of the Veteran Studies program. What is it? Veteran Studies program out at the University of Utah.
Yeah, so that was episode 7. It's strangely enough, and maybe I will, since we're recording, I'll see if I can't get you. I haven't reached out to Dr. Bryan to have him on my show yet, and I know that he's very responsive. But maybe you can make us an introduction. And, so episode 7 you had with him. So in that, again, like you said, was very veteran, focused on veteran mental health. So what kind of stuff did you get from his episode?
One of the things that I went into this idea with was that, the idea of veteranology was I really don't think I don't think a lot of us that suffer with our mental anguishes, depression, anxiety, whatever it is. I don't think a lot of it stems from our time in service. A good portion of it does, but I think what leads us to make the decisions that ultimately are our darkest hour, I think that comes from what we leave the military and then what we end up doing. We leave from this important lifestyle where, we're stressed out, especially if you're in the infantry or any of the combat arms. You're stressed out. You hate your officers. Your staff NCOs are out of touch. Everything is going wrong, but at the same time, you have this identity that's been given to you that is incredibly important, and it's on your chest. It says U.S. Army, it says U.S. Marines, and right next to it's your name, and no one can ever strip that of you. I mean, they can take your rank, but they can't strip that of you. And so, with Dr. Craig Bryan, it was just kind of brought to light that maybe I wasn't too wrong. And one of the things he talked about was that, if you go into the military with a certain, from a certain part of your life, you're most likely in 4 or 8 years going to go home to a certain part of life. And to kind of use a better analogy that my senior drill instructor said at boot camp was 13 weeks of boot camp isn't going to get rid of 18 years of mom and dad. And so you enter the Marine Corps as a certain type of person, and that person does get broken down and then built up into a soldier, a Marine, an airman, whatever it is, but that person is still there. And so if you do go back home and there's not a lot of opportunity in the place you came from, you have a spouse that you've been with, throughout the entire military, and you've always kind of got that connection to stress back home, that can wear on you, and you're no longer wearing your purpose on your chest. And without that, I feel like we start to look for our purpose elsewhere. And when we don't find it, then we kind of put those feelings maybe in a bottle or pills, and then we don't necessarily start going after our goals like we used to, or like we used to be told to. When you're a young infantryman, you're told, you're going to do these things to improve yourself. And when you're out of the service, you're no longer doing that. And so, long story short, I just think the episode with him kind of solidified this idea that we need to have a better sense of self and a better sense of where we're going when we decide that we're going to take off that uniform.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there is a lot of the challenges come between that choppy waters, however long it lasts after you leave the service, until you sort of, others have called it landed or transitioned or what have you. But there is that turbulent piece that lasts for however long it is. For guys of my father's generation, it maybe lasted decades when they came back from Vietnam. And that's what we're trying to do. I know I'm trying to do, and you in your own way, is to shorten that time for veterans to be able to figure that out. The idea of we carry out of the Army what we brought into it, or out of the military what we brought into it. I've seen that if there were certain challenges when you came in, the military almost acts as an amplifier. And so if there was struggles with alcohol or drugs when you came in, there's a greater chance that it is going to exacerbate. Same thing with anger, same thing with depression. If it was likely there before and then things in the military happen, it almost refracts, like going through a prism, and you come out and you amplify it. And then, as you said, there's things like, purposelessness and helplessness and figuring out how to meet your needs. So, and again, some veterans, that's an example of you, a veteran, talking about veteran mental health, not being a mental health professional. So I think that was a really great episode. That was sort of along the same lines with Stop Soldier Suicide, episode 13 for you.
Right. Jason Roncaroni might say that he is a mental health professional or not. He I don't think he was. I think he came out of the combat arms community like I did. I don't know what he's doing now. It's been like well over a year and a half, I think, since him and I have talked. But Stop Soldier Suicide was more of a discussion of not so much the symptoms and the mental health itself, but kind of a stopgap of, all right, we know there is a problem. Let's stop the problem now. It's like looking at a leaky pipe. Well, okay, let's stop the leak, and then we'll focus on the pipe later. But for them at Stop Soldier Suicide, it was all about trying to have a system in place where, let's say you were a sister or brother or just a buddy of somebody that you knew was at risk, and maybe talked about how they were just not finding their purpose, or they wish they were back in the military. There's all these different triggers I think that you can listen for, and like, hey man, do you want to talk? But if you're not able to kind of keep track of this person, you can talk to Stop Soldier Suicides, and they have caseworkers that have a set schedule and when they're going to be contacting this person. And I do need to do an after action episode to see how this program has been going, because it was relatively young when I spoke with them. But the concept was, get them talking, keep them talking, keep them engaged, be the one constant they might not have.
And of course, it's sort of maybe the elephant in the room where everybody talks about all the time, but veteran suicide is an epidemic. It's the numbers outstrip civilian deaths by suicide. I think again, and as you and I have talked often, but I know that I've lost more of my fellow platoon or company members to suicide than we lost while we were deployed. And I understand definitely what 2-7 has gone through. Suicide's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been a dark shadow over my battalion, and it's one that I think that we at this point have almost given some sort of anthropomorphic idea in our head as this sort of
like it's a demon or something.
Yeah, like just a looming. Interesting you say that. I was at a group. It wasn't group therapy, but it was a group roundtable in Washington D.C. to talk about the specific plague of suicides that has affected 2-7 for a certain generation. I think from 05 to 09, that 4 years. It's about 1,300 Marines and sailors. And, one guy told us it was a hilarious story. And he was being incredibly serious, but he knew how funny it sounded, so I didn't feel bad losing it. But he was talking about going down to Peru and drinking this Hiawatha, or it's not Hiawatha, that's the name of a chief, but this traditional shaman-induced drink. And he said that for him, his visions that he ended up having were very demonic, and one of the things that he had to do was stay in this trance that he was in, and he drank more of this stuff and ended up throwing up a lot. But he said, like, in his visions, he was throwing up, and he was getting rid of these demons. And since that incident, he has felt amazing, and that's something I need to investigate. I'm going to have him on my show, but just the idea that we recognize these things as demons. And I think, like, 1 suicide, okay, what happened? 2 suicide, okay, this sucks. 20 suicides, like, this almost seems unnatural.
Yeah, and that's one of the I think a recent report came out as far as a suicide contagion or things like that, and I know that you and a lot of your brothers in 2-7 have really struggled against that, and just trying to make sense of it. And sometimes the problem seems too big. How am I going to solve 22 a day? But again, and it goes into sort of the keep talking, right? I often say I'm not going to save any veteran tomorrow except one. That's me. I'm the only veteran that I know I can guarantee that I will see the sunrise tomorrow morning if I have anything to do with it. And you are the only veteran that has ultimate responsibility for you. And that's almost liberating in that we can spend time to be able to look eye to eye to another brother or sister and say, look, I don't want you to die. And so, one-on-one is much more manageable than 1-on-22.
Sure.
I'm just, as a therapist, I'm not sure I'm going to use the Peruvian shaman mystic drink as a therapeutic intervention. I might not be licensed, but it's interesting. I'll keep an eye out for that episode. I'll have to. But that's a great example of, look, whatever it takes, don't stop until something works. That was another one of your episodes, the Art of War. I really appreciated the conversation. I think that you and Kurt Bean had. I think that was one of the episodes where you were talking about the bearded a-holes too, and sort of that post-army disgruntled vet, shedding that that idea. But Kurt had a different way of sort of exercising the demons, if you will.
Yeah, he attacked things with himself and what he was going through. He went to a clinic. I think it was an inpatient clinic at the VA, and they had brought someone in to do art therapy, but it was like this very temporary thing. Like, someone came in for like a couple hours, and he was like, you know what? That was really great. And so when he got done with that particular clinic, and found whatever it was that made him right in the world with himself and the world around him, he decided, you know what, I'm gonna come back to the VA. I'm gonna bring a more in-depth program, and that's what he ended up doing, this Art of War program. And he then ended up getting a local shop owner. I can't remember the name of the shop. It's down on South Broadway in Denver. But he would have veterans come out, and it'd be free to veterans, and there'd be a charge for anyone that wasn't a veteran to just do art. No real sense of you're going to paint this way or you're going to like try to create this. It was, here are the tools, make art. And it was a really great experience. I went there twice, and I haven't seen him in a while. I know he's been up to a lot of stuff. He's actually, I think, in Iceland as a visiting artist. So he's definitely on a professional track now with his art, his own art, which is quite beautiful. But the one thing that him and I talked about when you brought it up earlier was this bearded persona that comes up on Facebook, at least for us. Like, obviously not every veteran has a beard, but I do. And
I do, sort of. It's a good
yeah, and there's a lot of angry people on social media, and social media gives us a really great place to be angry. And when you're angry, you don't have to be truthful to yourself. You don't have to grow. You don't have to challenge yourself. You can just be angry, and that anger gets you attention, and maybe that's the attention that you're looking for. But that you don't know how to get any other way. And, we were just talking about how, and I still do, I hate Facebook. I hate it so much, but it's how I connect with a lot of people, and it's important to how I do my business. But on a personal side, I hate it. I hate it so much. And the amount of anger that I see just about anything, Obama, liberals, just anything someone can be angry about. They will not only just post, but they'll also post like news stories, and it's just like this continuous spectrum of, I'm so angry at the world. Well, why aren't you out there changing something? The people that are out there changing something, they are not posting on Facebook. People are posting about them on Facebook.
You can't pick up a shovel if you've got a fist, right? You actually have to do something.
I like that analogy, man. That's great.
Yeah, and that's you're shaking your fist at the sky, and the sky's not going to change, but your fist is going to get tired, and you eventually got to do something.
Right.
I tell guys that the anger is extending their perimeter, is really what it is. If I lob enough rounds, then people are just going to stay away from me, and it's a way to isolate myself. It's the idea behind the fireworks. Don't the fireworks signs. Just PTSD vet lives here. when we were in the military, we didn't require the environment to adapt to us. We adapted to the environment. And so the anger is a way to sort of cause others around me to leave me alone, or whatever it is. And so it is very much a way to allow me to not have to tell my story and not to get it out there.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about ways that sort of like Kurt sort of overcame his thing. I recall I did again, the same thing that Kurt did, and I would recommend it to any veterans. Art therapy is good therapy, because as I'm thinking, the one painting, and it's a little, it's hidden somewhere in my house because it's not nearly as good as what Kurt does. But it was a landscape of a full moon at night in RC East with the river, and that was my dark place. And so if I had to paint something, that's what came out of me to be painted. And it's a good way to get yet another good way to get something out of your head, so you can look at it and say, wow, I didn't realize that part of it was that important to me.
You know what my favorite therapy is? Self-therapy.
What's that?
Helping people that I have no connection with.
Mm-hmm.
Like going beyond the raising money for a veterans charity, but going to a homeless shelter that has nothing to do with any sort of veteran group. Going to a school for children who, have bad homes, or, they're in the foster system. Just going to a church that I have no affiliation with and passing out food. Like, that's incredible therapy, because it gets you out of your comfort zone, because there's nothing there that says, anything that you see an EGA as a Marine and you feel connected, but you see a bunch of hungry people who have no connection to you whatsoever besides humanity. That's it. And the fact that you're probably all Americans, but like that's for me, that's been my favorite thing to do. And I try to do a couple things each year. You meet good people doing that, and I think it helps kind of take down some of your barriers as well.
And there actually is a necessity, Jay, to move beyond sort of an identity and to integrate an identity. An episode that I had recorded with Timothy Weinecke, who, as a clinical mental health counselor, as an Air Force veteran, but also he was involved in higher education. He said that there's a point in which he saw student veterans shed sort of they trimmed their beard, they stopped wearing whatever was in the duffel bag, and they actually went, like, there was a point maybe sophomore year, beginning of junior year or something, that they actually they made a shift, and he could tell that they moved beyond whatever that transitional identity is. And that's where I try to work with my veterans to say, okay, you were this and then you become something else. In many ways, I'm still in that very transitional identity, because I still talk to veterans all day. It's just like the platoon sergeant or first sergeant. I'm not talking to them, off the end of a water buffalo or sitting, under a tree. But you look at my office, and it's it's a retired first sergeant's office. It looks, and so I still do have a lot of the military identity, because that's part of my profession. That's part of my brand, really, if you will. But I think you hit on something, to move beyond just, taking your tribe out of the world, making the world your tribe.
Yeah, I mean, take the name tape off. You've got one right above your heart, and it says what branch you were in, and take it off and let the world in. It's not a dangerous place, and you can be of great value to the people around you.
Yeah, I mean, and even if some very horrific things happened, and even though we're drawing down, one of the best episodes I think that I enjoyed the most is Red Ramos, and Red, and I think even you and I were talking before, but he's shown what you can do beyond a disability, but even embrace the disability.
Yeah, no, he lost his leg below the knee, and from that point on, went through his his physical therapy, got involved with the Wounded Warrior Games while he was still in the Navy. Once he left the Navy, he still helped them as an actor, where they would bring these corpsmen out to like a Mount Town simulation, and explosion would go off, and you have someone screaming for help, and that's Redmond, and he's there, and he's got like a fake leg off of his body, and he's screaming, and he's got blood splurting, and it's all fake, and he's helping it out. And then ultimately he most recently was on The Amazing Race,
right, and
was showing what a disabled veteran was capable of in a very macho but professional way. Like, I felt like he exemplified an amazing person on that show every time I watched it. And he's never shied down from a challenge. And I think he is a person who is a great ambassador to the people that are around him for veterans and injured veterans.
Yeah, and you hear a lot, veterans say invisible wounds versus visible wounds, but I think that, it's hard to maybe separate the one from the other. Of course, if someone who, had an amputation, or a mentor of mine had said, PTSD doesn't give you a sexy scar on your face, and it's harder for that, but it's still it's a way that someone can survive and even thrive in spite of the challenges that they have, rather than use them as limitations. So you've got a lot of really great shows. Anything else you can think of that that maybe might have come up in the shows that you've done regards veteran mental health?
I think the overarching theme is be open. Outdoorsmanship, art, helping people. There's countless ways to help yourself. There's countless people to reach out to. I mean, I go to a therapist right now, and after the first meeting, she said, I'm not qualified to kind of go through the this whole military stuff. I was like, look, it may come up because it's a part of me, but I want you to know that I'm coming to you because I want to talk to another human about my humanity. I don't want to talk about my veteran stuff because I'm a veteran. And, she said, oh, okay, no, oh, great. And so far, I mean, I've really enjoyed the progress I've made with her, but, you don't, whatever it is that you need, go look for it, create it, and make it happen. Because if you're in trouble, hopefully there's somebody who's going to catch you before things get too bad. But that's not always the case, as I've found. And if you want to have a successful life, if you want to wake up every day ready to go, you need to be okay with who you are. And you need to appreciate the things that you've gone through with the lens of appreciation, but not one of identity. Don't look at yourself as, I need to get up because I'm Sergeant Knight. It's like, no, I'm going to get up because I'm Jay, and I've been through a lot, and I'm going to keep going through a lot because I'm going to get to the end of the road that I want to travel. So find your road, start hiking, find the help you need, and keep marching, man.
I think that's it's always some great advice, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show is you do have sort of a natural understanding of, look, we've got to stop the BS and continue on. Not that the mental health is a BS, but just all the obstacles in our way. And even the transparency of, you're still seeing somebody. And it doesn't have to be a veteran. I hear that a lot from veterans that, well, I'm not going to, talk to anybody unless, I'm not going to talk to a mental health professional unless they're a veteran. Well, number one, there's just not that many of us in the industry. Mm-hmm. And number two, it's, how do you know unless you try? It's just veterans don't need a whole lot of reasons to avoid talking to a therapist, but they never realize how beneficial it could be. So good on you, man, to really, I mean, and it is demonstrate. It's what we learned in the military, is to demonstrate excellence and not just talk about it.
Yeah, man, I'm just doing what I can. I got a lot of plates in the air, so if I don't take care of myself, who is?
Yeah, absolutely. So where can they find some of those plates, Jay? What if they want to find you online? How can they get a hold of you? Check out Veteranology and the rest of it.
Sure. So, best place to get announcements on the episodes is probably just going to be facebook.com/veteranology. You can go straight to the source at veteranology.com, or most of the podcast aggregators. I use Pocket Cast for myself, but if you use iTunes or something else, I'm not on SoundCloud. I've been working on that. But yeah, any of the usual podcast apps will feed from my publishing website. So yeah, all the episodes are on there. And we don't just do veteran interviews anymore. We have a talk show style where me and another guy I served with, Devin Black, just kind of talk about issues like being a dad and, what does Veterans Day mean to me and like that kind of stuff. And then we also, on Mondays, at least I try on Mondays, usually happens on Tuesday, we do a Medal of Honor reading. So just to kind of recenter yourself and look back at, again, like that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and get a little bit of pep in your step from knowing what somebody went through and found himself a hero on the other side.
Yeah, no, I've been listening to those. I like that you had one about Ed Too Tall Freeman on there.
Oh yeah,
I think it was back in August. So I'm a fan of Ed and of course the whole Aya Drang thing there. Well, Jay, I really appreciate you coming on the show and really giving us the insight. Your show's not about veteran mental health, but it is about veteran mental health, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
It was my pleasure, Dwayne. Thank you.
So there you have it, folks. Episode 19 of the Headspace and Timing Podcast. A great episode with the host of the Veteranology Podcast, Jay Knight. As we mentioned, we're focusing on the month of the military podcaster, as November obviously being Veterans Day, and veterans are really taking the time to talk about veteran mental health and talk about veterans issues all over the place, blogs, podcasts, social media. And so really appreciate Jay coming on the show to kind of talk about veteran mental health. And we talked a lot of different aspects of veteran mental health. In the beginning, Jay and I talked about his bike ride and how he said that it was the biggest Band-Aid that he needed. But really it evolved into the need for veterans to tell our story. Tell our story not just so that others may understand, but so that we may get some relief behind some of the pain that story comes with. And then we went on to talk about episode 5 with Russell Davies. Again, you can find all of these episodes, the links to these episodes in the show notes that we'll have on changeyourpov.com/HST19 and veteranmentalhealth.com/HST19. And so he was talking about Russell Davies and the importance of building trust in helping a veteran tell their story and trust just for the veteran to tell their story. And we talked about episode 7 of the Veteranology Podcast with Dr. Craig Bryan and Jay's thoughts about finding a new identity after leaving the service and how making that shift is necessary. That a lot of times it wasn't just the things that happened in the military that caused the challenges that we might have. And another big challenge, obviously, that many people talk about, it's not the root cause of the problem, but sort of the result of the problem is suicide and veteran suicide. So in episode 13, he talked about stop soldier suicide and Jay's thoughts on the suicide epidemic and how it has taken on sort of this life of its own. But Jay and I talk about how necessary it is that we can't solve the problem 1 on 22 a day, but we can certainly solve the problem 1-on-1. Then we talked about episode 16, The Art of War with Kurt Bean, and finding a way to get to the root of the problem through art therapy, or pretty much through anything. And Jay talks about his personal therapy of giving back to the community, and really in a way that has nothing to do with veterans or anything like that. And then Jay and I go down a rabbit hole of sort of the angry vet persona, and how does it really serve us and what we're doing. And then finally we wrapped up with Jay talking about episode 18 of the Veteranology Podcast, and Red Ramos, and Red becoming an ambassador, even is the word that Jay used, to show that veterans can thrive in spite of their challenges, in spite of their disabilities, that we don't need to accept it as our limitations. So I appreciate you listening to this podcast. I appreciate you listening to the other shows of the Change Your POV Podcast Network. So really appreciate you listening to Change Your POV Podcast, and we look forward to talking next week.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
So there you have it, folks. Another episode of Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to changing your perspective on veteran mental health. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use the track Not Alone from his amazing album, Combat Medicine. Doc's a guy who's trying to bring the discussions about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you need to check him out. Head over to therealdoctodd.com to purchase the album and support the cause. You're not alone, veterans. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created mini-me's. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life's so demanding. So much pain on this planet. I hurt each time I wake, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. You're not alone.
And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain. Stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.